Hi everybody, I just want to do a check and make sure you can hear me. If you can hear me, if you can't hear me, I'll type in the comments, but you might have your audio muted, and that way we can make sure everyone can hear me. We will begin shortly. I was having some issues here with the GoToMeeting. It booted me off my conference call, so we might start a minute or two after 10 o'clock here. Just give me a moment. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining today's webinar. We will be covering the universal waste management requirements within the state of California. If there are any questions as we go throughout, I will have everyone on mute. So please type your questions in the chat bar in your GoToMeeting connection, and I will try and answer those as we go throughout. If at the end there's still more questions, I will open up the floor and I will unmute people at that point so we can cover and have a brief discussion following today's presentation. On the first slide here, there is a URL to download today's presentation. There will be a password for it. The password is presented there, NESUWM 2017, and that way you can get the copy of today's presentation. Additionally, there'll be certificates available upon request. You can email me, and I will provide my email address at the end of the presentation today, or you can also email office@nesglobal.net, and copies of certificates will be provided to you guys. So my name is Nick Armstrong, and like I said, we will be covering the universal waste management regulations within the state of California and the specific requirements for universal waste generators. So we will cover briefly an introduction overview of the regulations and the regulatory requirements and where they can be found. Then we'll get into identifying universal waste, common types of universal waste managed in the state of California, and the hazards associated with those materials, the specific requirements for managing those universal wastes within compliance of the Health and Safety Code and Title 22 regulations, Accumulating universal waste on site, accumulation time limits, accumulation totals, and then we will get into training requirements, notifications to agencies, and reporting for types of universal waste managed at your facilities. And the amounts. And then lastly, we will briefly touch on shipping universal waste, because some of these universal wastes managed at these facilities, at your guys' facilities, may indeed be a DOT hazardous material. So we will talk about the specific shipping requirements for these. And some of the standards we will cover for common items include the management of batteries, lamps, mercury containing equipment, and where those standards are found within Title 22. We will cover the requirements for managing electronic devices, CRTs, and CRT glass. And we will touch on aerosol cans as a universal waste in California. Some of the businesses have multiple facilities in other states, and aerosol cans is a unique issue in California for being managed as universal waste. And then some additional miscellaneous items that are currently managed as universal waste, which in the future will be managed independently under their own regulations. Some examples of this is the photovoltaic modules for solar panels. And as we go through, if there's still some people joining us here, if you guys have questions, please feel free to provide those in the chat box, and I will respond to those as they come in. And then at the end, if you guys still have questions for me or about the presentation or something related, we can discuss that. I will unmute people at that point. So introduction, record keeping requirements, and some of the limits for generator status and the differences. So this came from the federal EPA, and this is what we implement in the state of California. There are accumulation limits before it changes your reporting status. So the separate category for universal waste handlers changes the reporting status. That is pretty much the only thing that you will see affected is the amount of reporting that is done. So quantity handled by generators, a small quantity generator of universal waste, less than 5,000 kilograms or 11,000 pounds on site at any one time, are not required federally to have an EPA ID number. And I think some of it at the bottom might be just cut off. But when you get a copy of the presentation, you'll be able to see all of it. But we'll discuss here what's on the table in case it is cut off on your screen. So large quantity handlers, if you handle at any one time more than 11,000 pounds at your facility, the EPA, federal EPA, has identified you as a large quantity handler of universal waste. There is no on-site accumulation limit for large quantity handlers. Give me one moment here. I'm having some issues on my screen. I apologize for that. I recently had a Windows update, and my GoToMeeting app actually didn't work, so I had to go through the web browser, which is a little different here for me. So I apologize for the delay. So federally, there are some standards where the EPA identification numbers are required or not required based on your generator status, and this table will be available to you guys in the presentation copy that you get. Storage limit for regardless of quantity, when you generate the universal waste, you have 1 year for on-site accumulation, and manifest of universal waste is not required as long as we are managing these wastes as universal waste, we can ship them off-site in shipping paper, bill of lading, but we are not required to use a uniform hazardous waste manifest. Personnel training, both generator categories here for the universal waste requirements do require training, and we'll see more when we get into the California regulations, specifically the type of training required. So the personnel managing the universal waste are required to have annual training. So generator categories in Title 22. I think my slides are a little delayed here because I am on, what is going on here? I'm on another slide, so give me one more moment. I'm not sure what's going on with this GoToMeeting right now. All right, I think everybody is with me now. We are on generator categories for universal waste. Conditionally exempt small quantity universal waste generator. We still use that phrase conditionally exempt in California. You saw earlier on the previous slide a very small quantity generator. That has to do with the RCRA changes that are coming up, which are not yet implemented in California. So what we call those in California is a conditionally exempt small quantity universal waste generator. This is a generator who produces no more than 100 kilograms of RCRA hazardous waste and universal waste combined, and less than or equal to 1 kilogram of acutely hazardous waste per month. And universal waste handlers, there's no separate categories within the regulations any longer for small and large quantity universal waste handlers. So anybody generating and handling universal waste are considered a universal waste handler. And so that these are the requirements for those handlers that we're going to go through here today. Some key definitions. We're going to cover some key definitions, and then we'll see how they apply and what they mean to our management on site of the material as we go throughout here. Management means the handling, storage, transportation, processing, treatment, recovery, recycling, transfer, and disposal of hazardous wastes. And when we use the term hazardous waste, we are referring to universal wastes here, because the universal waste would be a hazardous waste, but we get some exemptions, and we get some easier management standards that we get to follow. But that means we have to follow the rules, because this stuff would normally be managed as hazardous waste, and they give us a different rule set to follow. And as long as we follow that rule set, we get to maintain our description of these as universal waste. Generator or producer, any person by site whose act or process produces hazardous waste identified or listed in Chapter 11 of the RCRA and of the Title 22 regulations is what they're referring to, any site generating hazardous or universal waste, or any person by site whose act or process produces universal waste or causes a universal waste to become subject to regulation. What they mean by this is anyone who is actually creating a waste or abandoning a material or spilling material, any act that causes the waste to become subject to these regulations. So these standards are applicable to the generators or the producers of the universal waste. Universal waste is any of the wastes that are listed in section 66261.9 of Title 22. So when you see reference to 66261, we are referencing Title 22 regulations. So they have a list of universal waste, and we'll cover those here shortly. And a universal waste transporter means any person engaged in the off-site transportation of a universal waste by air, rail, highway, or water. So it's important to know what is a universal waste and when are we classified as a producer, when are we classified as a transporter, because some people do self-transport some of these wastes to household hazardous waste facilities, and we'll talk more about that at the end. It's important to know what applies, so defining what we're managing or dealing with, which part of the regulations we're in is important. some different wastes that are managed as universal waste. There's specific descriptions of what these are. Batteries. These are referring to small alkaline rechargeable, rechargeable batteries. This is not large lead acid automotive type batteries. What they're referring to here as universal waste batteries are the smaller consumer type batteries. Electronic devices. Mercury containing equipment such as switches, automotive type switches, thermostats that contain mercury, thermometers, any equipment that does contain mercury. Lamps, mercury, these are for mercury containing lamps and sodium containing lamps, so lamps that would be hazardous. Cathode ray tubes have a specific description, and then the CRT glass, broken CRT glass, has different management requirements as well. Aerosol cans, the description for those are actually found in the Health and Safety Code. That is where you find the management allowance as universal waste is described in the Health and Safety Code, and then they refer you to the regulations in Title 22 for the universal waste standards. Photovoltaic modules currently are allowable to be managed as universal waste. DTSC is currently working on some regulations specific to the PV modules, but right now the management standards are the universal waste standards apply to PV modules. Universal wastes are not considered for the purposes of a hazardous waste generator status determination. As long as you are managing the waste correctly and they are being managed on site and shipped off site and managed appropriately as universal waste, you do not have to consider the totals that you're generating for your hazardous waste generator totals, which is important because it can affect the types of record a hazardous waste generator needs to maintain and the training requirements and the determined training frequency. So it is important to know if it is counted or not, and this has changed. So I know there might be some questions here, or this might seem different. This changed in early 2016, where DTSC reissued the regulations for generator determinations, and they have flip-flopped on this a few years. The current standard is you do not have to count universal waste towards your status. So where we really are today, the requirements are found in Title 22 of the California Code of Regulation in section 66273. So that is where the standards for universal waste are found. So identifying universal waste, I think most people have a pretty good idea of some of the universal waste they generate, but it's still important to review what are specifically identified in these different categories, because sometimes there may be some confusions as to what are classified as universal waste batteries, which ones cannot be called a universal waste battery, and then which types of lamps are managed under these. And some lamps are not considered hazardous waste, and so we don't need to manage them as universal waste, and they can be disposed of in landfill, and we'll look some more as to what types of lamps are managed here. So specifically, the description for batteries is a device consisting of one or more electrically connected electrochemical cells designed to receive, store, and deliver electric energy. And they specifically identify that these are not to include spent lead acid storage batteries, which are defined in a separate section of the California Code of Regulations. So this is referring to any batteries that are not spent lead acid storage batteries. Electronic devices, any electronic device that is identified as hazardous waste because it would exhibit a characteristic of toxicity. And you'll see as we go throughout, the reasons a lot of these things are captured is because they would exhibit characteristics of toxicity, whether it is under the T-clip for the federally regulated waste, or if it would fail the wet thresholds for either the TTLC or the STLC. So if you had to run these tests on these materials, they would exhibit these characteristics of toxicity. For example, batteries oftentimes are very high in zinc, and zinc is a regulated metal in the wet table for California. And especially electronic devices, they contain lead solder and other heavy metals, so that is why they are regulated. Some common examples are computer monitors, televisions, DVD players, old phones, cell phones with the batteries removed. Mercury-containing equipment includes thermostats, mercury switches, thermometers, dental amalgam, pressure of vacuum gauges, mercury added to novelty items, mercury counterweights and dampers, dilators and weighted tubing, and mercury-containing rubber flooring and gas flow regulators. So a lot of these are actually containing elemental mercury. And so mercury containing equipment is a separate category and description. Lamps refers to the bulb or the tube portion of an electric lighting device. Fluorescent, high intensity, discharge, neon, mercury vapor, high pressure sodium, and metal halide lamps are all managed as universal waste. Some incandescent bulbs may exhibit characteristics of toxicity, but for the most part, incandescent lamps, which have mostly been phased out by now since everything is transitioned sort of to CFLs or LEDs, incandescent bulbs, though, are not necessarily universal waste. Some people take a conservative approach and manage them that way, but these are for fluorescent lamps and other lamps that specifically contain other hazards like mercury vapor or sodium vapor. We can talk a little bit about LEDs towards the end, but this does not specifically address LEDs, LED lamps. And from what I've seen, nobody is specifically testing LED lamps to determine if they're exhibiting characteristics that would capture them as universal waste lamps. Cathode ray tubes, a vacuum tube or picture tube used to convert an electrical signal into a visual image. I think for the most part, most people have actually phased these out of use. There still are a lot of CRTs in use though, especially larger, older TVs. A lot of these you see being generated actually by households though, and taken to household hazardous waste facilities. But cathode ray tubes are inherently high in lead, and so that is why the glass from those is captured. CRT glass, any glass released or derived from the treatment or breakage of one or more CRTs or CRT devices, and includes CRT funnel glass and panel glass. And these are inherently high, purposefully high in heavy metals. So that is why these are captured as hazardous waste, and we can manage them as universal waste. Aerosol cans is a container which a gas is under pressure, used to aerate and dispense any material through a valve in the form of a spray or foam. Aerosol cans managed as universal waste, the regulations are intended for non-empty aerosol cans. Empty aerosol cans, if they are in fact empty, not exhibiting characteristics of hazardous waste, whether it's reactive or ignitable or toxic, empty aerosol cans can be disposed of as scrap metal or thrown away in the garbage, but they must meet the definition of empty, which is written in the regulations as empty to normal practical extent. But non-empty aerosol cans are managed as universal waste in California. And there's some more stuff we'll talk about when we get into shipping and paying attention to where your aerosol cans are going if you are shipping them off-site as universal waste. Photovoltaic modules, PV modules, solar panels identified as hazardous waste can be managed as universal waste. Some, not all, but a lot of it would be hazardous waste. It does exhibit characteristics of toxicity. They intentionally add heavy metals to allow specific light penetration through the glass that is used on these modules, as well as some of the solder components. So there are some heavy metals in the PV module. So that is why they would be hazardous waste oftentimes, but can be managed currently as universal waste. There is some regulations DTSC has been working on over the past handful of years. They have not yet completed the regulatory review and actually published those yet, but there will be some specific requirements just for PV modules in the future. So like we talked about, universal waste, some examples: batteries, spent lamps, electronic devices, mercury-containing devices, aerosol cans. These are all of the common items generated within the state of California, as universal waste, aerosol cans, like I mentioned, is a unique issue within the state. And so we'll talk about the specific on-site management requirements for universal waste here in the next couple slides. If you guys do have questions, you can ask me as we go throughout. Don't hesitate to type something in the chat box or make note, and when I unmute everyone towards the end, we can address those. So identifying universal waste, I think, is pretty straightforward. Managing universal waste and what kind of containerizing we need to implement, and can they be in open or closed containers, is really, I think, some of the issues that people encounter, and which categories are allowed to be maintained in open, unclosed containers. So why these are, we talked a little bit about these in identifying, but just keep in mind why these are regulated is because they would be hazardous waste. So just keep that in mind when you're implementing your management programs, is that if you are not managing them correctly under the universal waste exemptions, the violations issued fall under hazardous waste control law violations or RCRA violations, depending on specifically what it is. There are some universal waste standards, but specifically what you wind up violating is hazardous waste requirements. So like we said, batteries contain various different metals, alkaline batteries containing zinc and other rechargeable batteries, cadmium, lithium, and they can be corrosive. Potassium hydroxide in some batteries. Electrical devices contain arsenic, cadmium, copper, and lead. The wires and the solder parts, some of the circuit boards. Mercury containing equipment, I think, is pretty straightforward. Contains mercury, either elemental or bound in a bound form. Lamps contain different vapors, including sodium vapors. And you see cathode ray tubes, CRT glass, heavy metals. And aerosol cans contain a variety of materials depending on what it is. You can have pesticides, so they can be highly toxic. They can be acutely toxic, extremely hazardous waste. They could be BP listed depending on what specifically the pesticides are. Or they contain propellants that are ignitable, and some of the paints themselves are ignitable liquids containing propane and butane often as the propellants. So they exhibit characteristics of being reactive and ignitable. Someone asked a question here about volumes of universal waste can make you a small or quantity or large quantity generator. The volume is not included in your volume calculation of waste. So when we talked about different generator categories of universal waste generators, the EPA requires federal EPA identification numbers. If you remember one of the first slides we got to after we covered the outline on that table, the EPA requires federal EPA ID numbers if you accumulate at any one time more than 11,000 pounds, and that's specifically for your universal waste generator status. And then in California, there's conditionally exempt small quantity universal waste generator, and that refers to RCRA EPA ID numbers, and not needing EPA ID numbers if you are a conditionally exempt small quantity universal waste generator. But the universal waste generator categories are independent of your hazardous waste generator category. Universal waste handlers don't have different categories. If you're handling universal waste in California, you have to follow the standards and the training requirements. Federally, they require EPA ID numbers at different thresholds. But being a universal waste handler is independent of being a small quantity or large quantity generator. And so there's sort of two separate issues to address. If you're a small quantity hazardous waste generator and you're doing the training, but you're not doing it annually because you're not required to as a small quantity generator, but you're still a universal waste handler, you still have annual requirements for the universal waste itself. If there's still more questions on that, when I open up the floor, you can ask me specifically about the different generator categories of hazardous waste generators and the effects universal waste has on those, which is independent of hazardous waste generator status. So the most common violations for universal waste handlers include breaking CRT glass without authorization. So treatment is a common issue people run into. Just a brief thing on treatment. It's much more in depth than we're really going to talk about here. But the definition of treatment, the technical definition of treatment, is any modification of your waste stream, whether you are purposefully or unintentionally doing it. Any change to the physical, chemical characteristics or composition, any change to the volume or weight, and the reduction of the weight or the volume of your hazardous waste for any specific reason. So breaking things reduces the volume. You can fit a lot more broken glass in a container than you can of these complete tubes. So that's why that is considered treatment. Another common form of treatment associated with universal waste is the puncturing of aerosol cans, and we can address that when we get more into the aerosol cans. Failure to prevent or contain spills of universal waste. Personnel training, not inadequate personnel training. That is one thing that sort of gets people confused, is being a small quantity hazardous waste generator and not needing the annual training, but they're still a universal waste handler, so they miss the annual universal waste training requirements. PPE for personnel handling universal waste. One thing to keep in mind, that the universal waste still is a hazardous material, would be a hazardous waste. So handling universal waste would require specific PPE depending on the types of waste being handled. Improperly classifying residuals, spills, and failure to submit annual reports. If you are if you do exceed the thresholds for some of the reporting requirements. So these are the things we hope to address and help you guys avoid in the future, facilitate compliance with the requirements. One thing on improperly classifying residuals, that sort of brings up the question too when people want to know about broken lamps. DTSC has explicitly said that lamps that are broken can be managed as universal waste. You do not have to manage those as hazardous waste. You cannot purposefully break lamps, but broken lamps, and there's several documents where they do identify that. It's also identified in the regulations. It's identified in their fact sheets, as well as some interpretations, that broken lamps can still be managed as universal waste. Some of the handlers, though, I know people have told me that their waste vendors tell them they cannot, and some of that has to do with their specific procedures, policies, and permits. They have permit restrictions, and it's not that they can't be universal waste. They may just not be clearly communicating that they cannot handle it at their facility. They do have permit restrictions on some of this stuff. A person who maintains a household and who produces universal waste from that household is a generator of household universal waste. So the household universal waste generator is exempt if it is managed correctly, does not dispose of it in the trash. So you are not actually the one doing the disposal of the universal waste. It's relinquished to another universal waste handler, and the household generator does not treat the universal waste. So in California, we do it a little differently than a lot of the other states and the federal regulations. Households are captured in our regulations for the most part, and really what happens is they get exempt from specific requirements. Households are not allowed to just throw things away in California like some of the other states do allow. Conditionally exempt small quantity universal waste generators. So this is one of the specific categories for the universal waste handlers identified in California. Generate no more than 220 pounds of RCRA hazardous waste, including RCRA universal waste. And the conditionally exempt small quantity universal waste generator is exempt if you are not disposing of it as a waste. You are not disposing of the waste yourself. It is relinquished to another universal waste handler, and the generator does not treat the universal waste. So you can take it to another Universal waste handler, you can take it to a household hazardous waste facility, and you cannot dispose of it yourself as long as you're not generating more than 220 pounds of RCRA hazardous waste and RCRA universal waste. This is the category you are identified as a conditionally exempt small quantity universal waste generator. Universal waste handlers, there are some notification requirements. If you must have a federal ID number prior to accumulating 11,000 pounds of universal waste. So you cannot accumulate 11,000 pounds of universal waste without having a federal EPA ID number. And handlers who accept electronic devices, CRTs, CRT glass from offsite sources must notify the department. When you see the department referenced, we are referring to Department of Toxic Substance Control, Cal EPA's branch that enforces these regulations, within 30 days prior to accepting the waste. If more than 220 pounds are received in a year, a report must be submitted to DTSC by February 1st of the following year. So if you are accepting universal waste off-site from your other locations or even other businesses, and at any point you have 11,000 pounds, you have some additional reporting and notifications that must be complete annually. Notifications can be made online for the CRT. The reporting is done at dtsc.ca.gov, hazardous waste /e-waste, and they have the instructions there. It's pretty straightforward. It's a summary of the amount of waste, the types of waste, and some additional information for you receiving the universal waste at your facility. Management requirements: universal waste must be managed in a way to prevent a release to the environment. So there's a lot of flexibility here in how you choose to manage your universal waste for the most part, as long as it looks like you are putting in solid effort and you are preventing spills, releases, and other accidents, specifically to protect human health and the environment. Containers, for the most part, accumulating universal waste, the regulations say they must be closed, structurally sound, and compatible with their contents, and lack of evidence or leakage. And then some specific waste streams, there are some exclusions from the closed container requirements. Electronic devices are not required to be in a closed container, and they explicitly pull this back out of the management standards there for closed containers. However, if you're not putting these in a container, you must either shrink wrap them together somehow so you can identify the universal waste, or you can label individually each piece of equipment, and you see that oftentimes with large TV monitors or large flat screens. You'll see people just label them specifically universal waste electronic devices, and also including the date on those. So you can individually label each piece of equipment. You can put them in big plastic rolling bins. You can put them in closed containers if you like, but somehow either the container or each piece of equipment needs to be marked and identified correctly. Damaged batteries, so batteries themselves, you need to protect the terminals so you do not create any heat, generate any fires. Damaged batteries must be stored in closed containers to prevent any leakage. Batteries that are spent or used of less than 9 volts, you do not have to protect the terminals if they are not lithium batteries. If they're alkaline batteries less than 9 volts, you do not have to tape them up. A lot of people do. It's a common practice. Some vendors will choose not to take them from you, but you're not obligated for batteries that are used or spent of less than 9 volts for alkaline to tape them. Lithium batteries, however, you are. Button cell batteries still pack a lot of energy. They are responsible for catching vehicles on fire, and they do have a lot of potential to create hazards, and they're very energy. There's a lot of energy reserved in those, even when you think they're dead, and something to consider as well. Keep them away from small children. There has been circumstances where they have actually been swallowed and caused death and severe burns. So those small lithium batteries, I see those a lot taken for granted. Make sure you're paying attention to those, because the last thing you'd want to do is be responsible for replacing a truck that catches on fire containing your lithium batteries in it. Spent lamps must be stored in a closed container. There's a lot more potential here for these things to release mercury vapor. They're very fragile. So lamps must be in a closed container. If you're putting them in a box, boxes are designed to be closed utilizing tape. If you're not buying a box that was designed specifically for lamps that didn't come with Velcro or some way to close it, you need to be taping your boxes shut. I have seen time and time again where facilities are being issued violations for not having boxes closed. I have seen the federal EPA write 4 violations to one facility because their lamps were not in a closed box. They had them in a box, they were marked and dated, however the box was not taped shut. So make sure you're closing these boxes. I know it can be a hassle, but it is a requirement, and they do commonly issue violations for lamps in open containers. Handlers are required to mark or label the containers holding universal waste, identifying the type of universal waste. So, for example, universal waste electronic devices, universal waste batteries, universal waste aerosol cans, whatever type of electronic or whatever type of universal waste, it needs to be identified following the words universal waste. You're not required to date the universal waste containers like you are hazardous waste. However, you have to be able to prove how long you've had it, when it was generated. And since most people don't keep rolling inventories and some other way of accurately identifying when it was generated, it is a very good practice. And some people think that it is a requirement, but you should be marking these with the date to identify when the accumulation of that material started. This is a common label. It does have the accumulation start date area on it, and then in the contents there describing what specific type of universal waste. The labels don't have to be purple. This is not the specific label you have to use, but this does contain the content that needs to be on the container, either marked directly on the container or put on a sticker or a label. So some people choose to store leaking batteries separately. It is a good practice. Just make sure you're identifying the words universal waste and the type of waste on the container. This is a common way people are containing their batteries. If you're doing it this way, make sure that the terminals are being protected. Make sure there's no leaking batteries. I see a lot of times people have large containers of lots and lots of batteries. It is a good practice, though, to put them in closed containers, because the likelihood of maybe having a damaged battery in there is pretty high. So make sure if you're not putting them in closed containers that you're able to communicate to your employees and they can identify damaged and undamaged batteries correctly. Labeling your universal waste on site as hazardous waste is fine if you choose to manage it as hazardous waste, and then you would have to manifest it off site, and it would count towards your generator status. Taking advantage of the exemption means that you're following the rules. If you don't follow all the rules, then it puts you back in the hazardous waste category. So calling it hazardous waste on site and then shipping it off site as universal waste is conflicting. The regulations say to maintain the exemption, you have to manage them on site with the words universal waste and identify the contents, not calling them hazardous waste. You can choose to manage them as hazardous waste, but most people don't like to do that because it increases their fees, their disposal costs, and can change their generator status. So we talked about the management requirements for these universal wastes. As we are accumulating the waste, those are the standards for how to manage them on site. Accumulation time limits. There are limits. You cannot just hoard your universal waste, even though it does pose significantly less hazard to the environment. That's why they allow for the exemption. You are restricted to 1 year. You cannot accumulate universal waste for more than a year at your facility. So you need to be able to demonstrate, though, when the accumulation started, and that's typically why we are including an accumulation start date on each container. So if you haven't been, it's a very good practice to include the accumulation start date for your universal waste, unless you have some sort of accurate inventory and you're able to track specifically when the material was generated. Personnel who manage universal waste must be trained in the following: the hazards associated with the universal waste. So specifically, what types of universal waste are you generating, and what hazards are they exposed to with managing that material? If they're managing aerosol cans that are flammable or sharp, things that can be potentially sharp, like lamps and the mercury vapors and the hazards associated with that material. The disposition of the universal waste, what to do when released, what to do if they spill it, labeling, handling, consolidating, and shipping requirements, if that is their responsibility. So this is a little more specific to what exactly are they doing. They don't need to sit through a 4 or 8 hour hazardous waste management course if all they're managing is universal waste. And remember, management means the handling, storage, transportation, process, treatment, recovery, recycling, transfer, or disposal of the waste. So if they are handling the waste, if they're generating it and they're putting it in containers, and that's their responsibility, make sure that they are aware of the hazards associated with that activity, what to do if it spills, who to notify, where's the spill equipment, what types of hazards, and the types of PPE they need to protect themselves from. So that can be a brief, 15, 20-minute training on the specific types of waste they're generating. Personnel who are generating used batteries and generating used lamps all the time, they're going to have a very brief training associated with something like that. So if they're not responsible for shipping and the transportation of it, you probably don't need to have them go through all that specific information. Training must be provided initially and annually. Universal waste handlers must provide each employee initial training, and they have to do this annually. So this is where one thing for small quantity generators, there sometimes is a gap because they are associating the universal waste training requirements and the hazardous waste training requirements as one and the same, and they're not. So if you're not doing annual training for your hazardous waste requirements, if you're a small quantity generator, make sure you are not missing the universal waste annual requirements. Records must be maintained on site for 3 years from the date the person has last managed the waste. So if they quit or if they get a new job, you need to maintain the training records for each person managing universal waste for 3 years. Common theme, 3 years for our records. Responses to releases. Releases must be immediately contained. The handler shall determine if any of the material from the release is a hazardous waste. If so, it must be managed as hazardous waste. Hazardous waste consisting of residues or leaking, broken, or otherwise damaged universal waste is allowable to be managed as universal waste. And this is the regulation where you'll find it in Title 22, Section 66273.37. And they'll specifically identify in there that you can manage broken or damaged universal waste still as universal waste. It does not necessarily become hazardous waste. Something like a large spill of elemental mercury, though, in soil or contaminating other material may change your universal waste exemption to creating a hazardous waste that's now contaminated. So that's something to consider if you've spilled it and generated hazardous waste, or if it's just residues from a cleanup of broken universal waste. So we'll talk a little bit briefly about shipping universal waste. This is not a transportation course. So if you are preparing hazardous materials for shipment, if you are responsible for containerizing the stuff and you're ultimately the last person packing the waste, or if you're signing paperwork or loading vehicles, this is not enough to cover that. This is just a brief overview of some of the hazards associated with it and the specific requirements that they care about from a hazardous waste, universal waste perspective. So don't forget, you still may need some DOT training if you are preparing shipments or signing documents. So off-site shipments, you are allowed to self-transport universal waste. You must comply with the federal DOT transportation requirements, though, and oftentimes universal waste does meet a DOT hazardous class, DOT hazard class. Lithium batteries, some rechargeable NiCad batteries, aerosol cans, obviously, compressed gases, oftentimes flammable gases. So make sure um, we're identifying, correctly classifying, and characterizing our material. So a generator is responsible for DOT regulated materials. DOT refers to the shippers as the offerer, so the offerer's responsibility, properly classifying the hazardous material. If you have elemental mercury, that is a DOT corrosive material, so those are the sorts of things you have to be able to identify. Is it in the appropriate container? Are you using a UN authorized container for that specific material? And have you labeled and marked the container correctly? So the DOT marking requirements are going to be different than what is necessary for the on-site accumulation. So are you correctly preparing the shipment markings and putting it in the right container? And if you're shipping a placarded load, make sure you are providing placards. It is the offerer generator's responsibility to provide placards. Oftentimes we have our vendor sort of do this as a service for us, but just keep in mind this is the generator and offerer's responsibility. Um, Tracking shipments. Handlers shall keep a record of each shipment of universal waste being sent from their facility. A log, invoice, manifest, bill of lading, or other shipping documents. You can manifest the universal waste if you want. It's not a recommended practice because it does lead to some confusion. You can use a manifest. You don't have to use a manifest. And most people choose to use things like bill of ladings. Some people use a company called Call to Recycle where they send a prepaid shipping label and it's free to dispose of rechargeable batteries. They want that material back, so they've battery manufacturers have paid in that. They provide you a monthly summary, so you have a record of where all your waste is going. Some kind of record to show that we're not disposing of it in the trash, and that we're properly sending it to the right facilities, either disposal or recycling. The record needs to include the name and address of the destination facility, quantity and type of the waste, and the date of the shipment. Records must be maintained from 3 years from the date of shipment. So commonly, our records, we need to maintain them for 3 years. Most of the time, people keep them indefinitely. Transporters. Universal waste transporters are not allowed to treat or dispose of the universal waste unless they are also permitted for that. But this is for universal waste transporters. A lot of times people like to self-transport, so this is something to keep in mind. You can only transport 5 CRTs at any one time unless they are packaged to prevent breakage. So really you can transport many more, but you need to containerize them or prepare them for shipment so they are not going to release hazardous material while they're in transit. Can only transport 220 pounds of electronic devices at one time unless they are packaged to prevent breakage. So there is a restriction, but most of the time people are putting these things in containers. That's why we don't oftentimes consider this restriction. So universal waste transporters, you must comply with DOT regulations. Like I said, some of these materials can be DOT hazardous materials, and knowing what the limits are and when they need to be placarded, what the proper markings are. I know lead acid battery is not specifically covered here, but a lot of times you'll see people carrying large amounts, or they have recyclers pick up their lead acid batteries. And they think of it just as a scrap metal because they're picking up all their other recyclables, but things like lead acid batteries are hazardous materials. So those are the sorts of things you need to be aware of. Is your transporter properly complying with the DOT regulations, or are you, if you are self-transporting? Immediately respond to any releases. So if there is any spill or accident while in transit, there must be an immediate response to the release. Transport universal waste to a handler or a destination facility. So you need to take it to another universal waste handler or a destination facility, meaning somewhere where it does get treated, recycled, or disposed of. And you can ship them on uniform hazardous waste manifests. You should not. You do have to pay fees based on all the weight that goes on a manifest. And it does oftentimes lead to confusion. It may not be clear that you were managing it as universal waste if you're putting it on a hazardous waste manifest. So it's recommended you use a shipping paper, bill of lading. some other way to transport the material other than a uniform hazardous waste manifest. However, it is not a violation to use one. It just creates a lot of other confusion and sort of a trail that has to be clearly laid out. So there are some other things for treating universal waste on site. We didn't really get into that today. There's not that much time for this, and I went a little longer than I was hoping to, and mostly because of the technical difficulty I was having there towards the beginning. But I will be here. I'll hang out as long as there are questions. I'll provide my email in the comment section as well. My name is Nick Armstrong again, and I do appreciate you guys attending today's webinar. My email address, though, is narmstrong@nesglobal.net. If you have any specific questions, you can shoot me an email. I have provided my email address here in the comment section. And if there is other questions related to our training or some of the documentation, the records associated with today's webinar, you can email me or office@nesglobal.net. So that's office@nesglobal.net. And if you would like a copy of today's presentation, if you go to nesglobal.net/webinar -downloads, the password to download a copy of today's webinar is NESUWM, all in capitals, NESUWM 2017. And that's here on the last slide. So if you want a copy of today's presentation, if you have trouble with that, you can shoot me an email and we can get it to you guys. But it has been made available there. If there are any other questions, you can shoot me a chat here, and I can answer it that way, or I'm going to unmute everyone. So I would like to ask, so if you guys are not specifically going to ask a question, please keep yourselves on mute just to keep the background noise down. So I'm going to open the floor for questions at this time.
I think, don't unmute it. Right.
You guys have been unmuted if you have a question.
We'll just exit here. I'll have a copy of the slides. So
yeah, if you want a copy of the slides, if you go to nesglobal.net/webinar-downloads, you can download it there. I'll type that in the comments too, but that's here on the last slide down at the bottom. nesglobal.net/webinar-downloads, and then the password is in all caps, NESUWM 2017, and you can get a PDF copy of today's presentation. So I'll be here if there's any other questions, or if you guys would like to email me at narmstrong@nesglobal.net. So you guys can hang out if you'd like to hear other questions, if there are any, or I'm done with my presentation today, and I do appreciate you guys all attending. Someone mentioned the webinar is not available at the site. We will make sure to get that available. I'll check. I'm not sure if maybe we got the wrong URL provided to you guys. But it was indicated to me that we had put the link there. Has anyone else been able to successfully get that? If you have, let me know in the comments or provide a reply. Yeah, there's a link there. If you go to nesglobal.net/webinar-downloads, there's a link for today's presentation, and then the password is NESUWM 2017. And it seems to be working for me. There's a student resources packet there with copies of the slides, and then some additional attachments, DTSC fact sheets attached there at the end related to universal waste. It is available. If you're still having troubles, shoot me an email, and I will get a PDF copy emailed to you. Someone asked about the voiceover. I don't typically provide a copy of the voiceover. If you'd like to reach out to me, we can potentially do that. I do record it, but it's not typically something that's provided. Just shoot me an email or call the office, and we can discuss specifically what that about that issue. Does no one have any specific questions from today's presentation currently? If not, feel free to contact me at a later time if there is.